to understand and read. However, look at Hegel in relation to Marx. Many people maintain, and I am one such person, that Marx remained an Hegelian throughout his whole life. Come on to that. But to understand, we started discussing some weeks ago postmodernism. But to really understand postmodernism, you've got to understand people like Hegel and Marx. So having introduced postmodernism, we're doing a very typical dialectical thing. We're going back to the previous stage. And I hope you had a chance to browse through my notes on the subject. Very brief, very highly simplified. But I thought there's some themes we could discuss and explore to which we are indebted to Hegel. Hegel himself, of course, is a philosopher whose writings are the culmination of 2,000 years of European philosophy. So, to understand Hegel, you've got to understand other people, and you end up going back to Plato and Aristotle. Obviously, we can't do that today. So I'm actually decontextualizing Hegel rather artificially, but try and see the connections to Marx, and I'll be interested to see to what extent you think Hegel and Marx are saying very much the same thing. So I'll just go through my paper very briefly and ask for any clarifications on this obtuse subject, then have a discussion about the implications. It is often said that Marx and Marxist thought is a combination of three things. So first of all, Marx, he was in his young days, in his student days, belonged to a group called the Young Hegelians. Marx was heavily influenced by Hegel. Come on to that in a bit. And it's important to note that in the 1830s, 1840s in Europe, it would have been impossible not to have been influenced by Hegel. Just like today, we're influenced by Darwin and other things we take for granted. In the 1830s, 1840s, Hegel was taken for granted. Everyone, that's their starting point. In Europe, not so in Britain, but in Europe, is very, very influential thinker during this period. Hegel died in 1832, and Marx himself was at that stage a young student studying philosophy, and in particular studying Hegel. So Hegel was this major influence on Marx's thinking, as other people at the time as well. The second component of Marx, as we know, is that he is heavily influenced by the British school of political economics, in particular Adam Smith and Ricardo, and those who studied Marxist economics to understand the connection here with Marx's theory of labour, theory of value, which is derived from Smith and Ricardo, which Marx developed. And most importantly, the third dimension in Marx's thinking and Marx's thought was an understanding of the French revolutionary tradition, which 1789, the French Revolution, 1848, a very important, famous year. The whole of Europe was ablaze with revolutions. and various shapes and sources. Then, of course, the Paris Commune of 1871, when briefly the workers of Paris ran Paris. So a lot of Marxist thinking, a lot of what Marx was concerned about was his relationship with other socialists of the time. And there was an endless debate, controversies between him and other socialists, other radical thinkers from different perspectives. So Marx is a combination of all these three things. And what we're doing today is just touching the surface really about how Hegel influenced Marx and what did Marx take from Hegel. And I've given you some quotes from Marx, the famous one about philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. Everyone knows that. But some other quotes which I've put down for you. But I think it's interesting that as a mature writer in 1873, when Marx was at the peak of his intellectual powers, he paid homage to Hegel in Das Kapital. He explains that although he thought Hegel got it wrong in some senses, his basic ideas were very sound. So hence this notion of the rational kernel in the mystical shell. So that's where Marx was coming from. In one sense, he acknowledged Marx was his mentor. And like all students, sometimes they think they've gone beyond their mentor and taken different directions. So this connection to Marx is very important. And if you read Das Kapital, it's peppered with Hegelian terminology. It's routinely use Hegelian words, Hegelian terminology. Anyone who's read Marx will recognize his terms. So that's kind of the broad perspective. And what I've suggested for today is I've tried to isolate three themes from Hegel, which reappear all the time in Marxist theory, in Marxist writings. So the first area, which we can perhaps discuss in more depth, and we began to explore this also when we looked at postmodernism, which is what's called idealism, philosophies of idealism. So Hegel was an idealist in that tradition. Idealism has a 2,000-year-old history going back to the Greeks, Plato and Aristotle. And for many, many centuries, it was taken for granted. It was not controversial. The idea was that ideas or thoughts are actually more real than the apparent world. This notion of the appearance of things, what appears to be the case, then behind that a much deeper, more real phenomena is a part of idealism. The belief that there's some sort of special force behind the appearance of things, which actually determines and shapes our reality. In particular, this notion of ideas become before of a primary source of the world. To our modern thinking, this is kind of a strange idea, but it's actually quite logical. Let me try to give you an example. If this notion of ideas are real and the material world just reflects those ideas, you can see where Marx took umbrage at this and turned it back around again. But if you consider an example. If you say a black man in a field of cotton, picking the cotton and putting the cotton into a bag on the back, and if you see just down the road a horse, on that horse is a white man, the white man has a whip in his hand, then you can infer, can't you, we are seeing here slavery, plantation slavery. But of course, without the idea of plantation slavery, without the idea of private property, without the idea of oppression, without the idea of colonialization, that scene in itself has no meaning. In other words, to understand reality, you've got to have some meanings, some agreements about what we're seeing, how we interpret things. So idealism is taking this notion of the idea as being prior to the reality it is describing. It's kind of a funny kind of concept. It's most simply put by Plato, who talked about a table. If you imagine a table as a concept, a table with a big T, it's the perfect table. It's a table in our mind. It's a concept of a table, and it is a perfect table. And then, of course, in the human world, you get lots of particular tables. They're just tables which seek to be like the perfect table. But so you get millions and millions of particular tables, but none of these particular tables, which come and go, they may be destroyed, they may disappear, but nonetheless, we still retain this idea of a perfect table. So in Platonic argument, the perfect table is more real than actual tables. The perfect table is a concept which persists and doesn't go away. Your particular table may be burnt, stolen, disappear, break up, and rot. So this notion that the idea of something is more real than what's called the reality or the appearance of things is a very important theme in Western philosophy, as also elsewhere, of course. And Hegel had his own particular notion of the idea, this kind of life force, what he called Geist or spirit. Spirit is the true reality in the world, and the world itself is a world of appearances. Now you can begin to see here Marx's ideas emerging, because although he rejects Hegel's notion of the primacy of idea, he turns it upside down, but he still retains this notion of the appearance of things and true reality. So the appearance of things, the commodification of our lives, the bourgeois world, which is just the appearance of things. Underneath the appearance of things, there's a true reality called the mode of production, exploitation, and so on and so forth. So Marx retains this notion of appearances versus a deeper, higher reality. And this is Hegel's notion of idealism. What was different about Hegel compared to other idealists was that he believed that the idea of things, this cosmic force, this life force, is only appearing in our own realities. In other words, it's not some sort of transcendent godlike thing. It's actually a phenomena which we experience in our everyday lives. So for Hegel, this notion of this life force, this cosmic force, which controls everything, is played out in real time, in real history. And this is Hegel's important contribution to all this kind of debate, is that in one sense, the ideas of things are actually played out in real life, and real life and ideas interchange, they intermix. And of course, we have this notion in Marx called infrastructure and superstructure. Right, the idea of things and what they refer to get intermeshed. And Marx, of course, stressed the primacy of infrastructure. We'll come on to that. But it matters not in one sense, because what Hegel did was to actually provide a conceptual framework that there are two worlds. There's a world of ideas, there's a world of material activity, and the two somehow come together. And only in that way can we actually understand and interpret the world. So I shan't say any more about idealism because it's a very long subject. But remember that the postmodernists themselves, in one sense, idealists. They simply say that the idea of things is all there is. That's all there is. There's nothing behind discourse. Discourse is everything. It's simply a set of relationships between people. But if you go back to the analogy of the enslaved person and the overseer in the cotton field, you can see how the idea of slavery, which entails the notion of property rights and ownership, the idea of oppression, of brutality, of violence, the idea of an overseer representing the oppressor. You can see these are ideas which give meaning to that scene. So it's almost impossible to visualize anything of significance which doesn't have meaning based upon ideas. So Marx was about exploring the relationship between ideas and what these ideas refer to. We know he's got his own particular version of it, but this is what Hegel introduced, this notion of the connections. So a part of Hegel's other contribution to the Marxist debate is that he had this idea of an underlying universal human nature, that there's something unique about being a human being, which is our proper nature. And of course, Marx said exactly the same thing. For Hegel, our proper nature can only emerge in its fullness throughout history. So it emerges in a passage of time and history. The idea is that as we progress as a species, so this notion of progression is very important. As we progress as a species, we come to know ourselves better and better and better, and we come to realize our true natures. And the purpose of history is to make explicit our true natures, so that we can live ourselves as we are properly meant to be. So this notion of progression towards our true natures, dismissing, trying to get rid of all those things which repress our true natures, is really the history of history. In other words, it implies a struggle. That so in one sense, Hegel, and this comes from the Greeks, Hegel has this notion of a higher self and a lower self. The higher self is a person and humanity which realizes its true nature, and the lower self is a basic set of needs about just surviving. And of course, this notion of higher and lower, basic and above basic, this notion of flourishing is implicit in Marx. Marx is all about the liberation of human beings in history through the passage of time. So this notion of human flourishing, to realize our true natures, to become free people, is quintessential Marx, and it derives from Hegel. So we can discuss this aspect. So it's called this naturalistic approach about human flourishing. What we mean by human flourishing, Marx had a very clear view about it. And as we all know, he prescribed a communist society as being a society in which we can all flourish as people. So one of the key questions emerging out of this notion of flourishing and the struggle to flourish is, how do we go about achieving our flourishing? Because it doesn't just happen. It requires human agency. We have to do something about it. It's not going to happen on its own. So this notion of progress and flourishing, and how do we affect it, and what are the barriers to it, is what Marxism is all about. And to that, we are indebted to Hegel. So now I'll just finish briefly how this notion of idealism, notion of freedom manifesting itself in history, how this flourishing, how do we kind of measure this? How do we track it? What system of thought, what methodology do we employ to engage in this process? And of course, it's for dialectic. So most students of Marx, are familiar with dialectics. Marxist dialectics, it's a term which is bandied around, less well understood really, but Marx took Hegel's notion of dialectic and used it to provide an explanation of the possibility of progress. It's a very important mindset jump, because up to this period in time, there's no assumption of progress whatsoever. The assumption was that things are as they are. You can't really change things very much. Things are static, things are permanent. There are poor people and rich people, and that's how the world is. This notion of permanence and stasis is what Hegel's ideas enabled other people to challenge the status quo. And of course, in modern times, the postmodernists, the post-structuralists themselves revert back to this notion that everything is static. There's no real change. They are rejecting Hegel's notion that society is dynamic and that it can change. And this is based upon the dialectics. So I briefly finish on dialectics. And people are familiar with the Marxist notion of dialectic, the thesis, the synthesis, being thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and so on, and contradictions. But the key thing to Hegelian dialectics is this notion of contradiction. Is that as we move through history, we reach a certain stage of development, which is very much, of course, the point Marx took up. We reach a stage of human development, which generates of itself more and more contradictions, and the pressure builds up so that these contradictions have to be reconciled. So you get an antithesis. You get a movement to challenge the status quo. In this process, the two interact. And out of this interaction, out of this negation of the negations, it's called, we end up in a kind of a different way. There's been progress, there's been movement, people become slightly more free. There's been a bit more liberation. It doesn't always happen, and you can have setbacks, but the point is, in the long run, there's a tendency through this dialectical engagement, there's a tendency for human liberation evolving. So if you look at history of, say, Europe in particular, you see this dialectical engagement taking place, from slavery through feudalism to capitalism, and of course Marx was very concerned about the next stage of liberation, which is post-capitalism. So this dialectics is a very important concept. The way Hegel puts it, it's not awfully complicated, but the principle is very simple. Is that we encounter contradictions, and those contradictions are challenged, exposed, and in the process they are overcome, and we get to a different level of understanding, and then we repeat the whole process. And this is Hegel's great contribution to Marx's theory, dialectics, because Marx based the whole of Capital on a dialectical process, leading up to what he thought was to be the imminent collapse of capitalism in the mid 19th century. So let me stop there, because I hope you read my paper, and I did a quick summary of it. We can then perhaps discuss these three concepts of dialectic, of human nature and flourishing, and also this notion of ideation and what I said, because I know what I'm saying, but sometimes what I say is not clear to other people. So there's a chance to clarify some of these basic points. If you don't understand something I said, we can clarify that, so I have a discussion about it, and then see whether or not you yourselves actually are Hegelians. I suspect that you are, when it comes down to it, although you may not wish to admit to it, but I suspect that you are. So over to you.
Okay. Okay, Surinder.
Thank you.
Surinder.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Paul. That was reminds me of bits of things that I've read before. But what I wanted to ask was, the Protestant ethic.
Yes, yeah.
So is that? Would you say that that's based also in Hegel's ideas?
Yeah.
And how does Kant's philosophy in that? How does that fit into?
Right. Okay. Well, Kant's Hegel. Well, you've got two questions. First, about the Protestant ethic. Well, it was during this period, of course, of that a bit earlier, we get the Protestant Reformation, and the so-called Protestant ethic, in Marxist terms, would be seen very much as kind of a superstructural response. The Protestant ethic, if people are not sure what that is, it's a strange kind of notion of Protestant ethic, which people like Weber talked about. But the idea is that people are put on earth by God to strive and work and to justify their place in heaven when they die, and to strive and work hard every day. So in other words, they're privileging industry, hard work, labor, as a way of enriching yourself. And so this notion of, and this is very much a bourgeois mindset, to justify capitalism and to justify the appropriation of surplus value and so on and so forth. So the Protestant ethic is a set of ideas which privileges the individual to make money by working hard. And so in other words, you get your just rewards in terms of how hard you work. So this, of course, a great apologia for capitalists, because they claim that they are reaping the fruits of their hard work. The profits arise out of capitalist enterprise, out of their hard work. So you can see the connection with Protestant ethic and merchant capitalism. And of course, this coincides with Hegel's own philosophy. So Hegel himself tended to support this view that capitalism, the bourgeois state, was indeed the most advanced civilization in the history of history, and it was the best place to be. Now, of course, Marx said something very similar. Marx talked about how, in the beginning, capitalism transformed the world for the better. It revolutionized relationships. Its productivity was very important. So don't forget that Marx did not dismiss capitalism at its outset. So he saw what it did, how it overturned the old authoritarian regimes, feudalism. In other words, Marx saw in capitalism a sign of human progress, which we tend to forget. That's a very important part of Marx's thinking. And of course, this is what the Hegelian dialectic does, because the progress made by capitalism, of course, is incorporated into Marxist communist theory. Hitherto, there could be no equality because resources were too scarce. Under capitalism, enough food is produced to feed the world. So capitalism generated the conditions of production, which means that no one needs starve. We know people do starve because capitalism is greedy, but the point is they have created a condition under which everyone can be fed. So the next stage is, of course, is to overcome capitalism to the next stage of development. But the link with the Protestant ethic is a very clear one. It privileges the right of individuals to accumulate, and that's seen as a God-given obligation on Protestants in particular to do that. So, I mean, we can discuss that in great length. That's kind of connection. Kant himself, Hegel's starting point was Kant, and he sought to refute Kant. Kant was an idealist who claimed that you could know nothing at all, really. It's impossible to actually know anything with certainty. And of course, Hegel said you can know things with certainty. So just as Marx flipped Hegel upside down, Kant was flipped upside down by Hegel. So there's a connection. But Kant introduced a very important principle. It wasn't new, but the way he introduced it was new. It introduced what's called the categorical imperative, a very important concept in philosophy. It had been around for thousands of years in different religions. But what Kant did was to say that treat everybody as you wish to be treated yourself. That's a very old adage. It appears in Judaism and elsewhere. But treat each other as you wish to be treated yourself. It's a very important principle, which he thought he could prove by reasoned argument, so-called categorical imperative. This notion of respecting each other person as you wish to be respected yourself is a very important move in ethics, which has connotations about equality and fairness and so on and so forth. What Hegel did was try to give this some sort of dynamic motor. Kant simply stated it as a kind of a reasoning argument. What Hegel did was try to show how this principle was emerging through history. And of course, this notion of treating each people as equals, as ends in themselves. So Kant said, do not treat people as a means only, treat people as an end in themselves, as you would wish to be treated yourself. Now, of course, capitalism treats people as a means to an end, as a means only. This is what's called alienation, exploitation. So this notion of treating people as an end in themselves reappears in Hegel, who says this is emerging in history, and Marx picks up the idea of people being treated as ends in themselves in a social society. So there's a strong connection. All this is connected. Does that help explain things? To some extent, yeah. Made up of mostly slaves, so-called helots, who live miserable lives. They're there to serve this aristocratic class of contemplators. So in Aristotle and Plato, the higher self, the self of contemplation, of literature, poetry, reasoning, arguments, this higher self was a preserve of a small minority. But of course, as we progress through history, the idea is that more and more people are enfranchised to reach their higher selves, hence universal education, so on and so forth. And in Marxist society, if we can visualize it, it can all become our higher selves. We do our work, we create work which is of use, we share it with each other, and we have lots of leisure time to do other things, like debates and discussions. As you get in Cuba, you go into Cuba, some people have been to Cuba, and every street has a committee, every street discusses everything every night. You do your day's work and you come together to discuss local issues. You put forward proposals to the National Assembly. Cuba is an enormous talking shop, and it's kind of trying to reflect Marxist theory into practice. So this notion of flourishing goes all the way back to the Greeks. The issue is how this notion of flourishing got transformed in history. So in bourgeois philosophy, flourishing end up making lots of money being a capitalist, being an individual. It lost sight of the sociality aspect of flourishing. In feudal times, flourishing was being in your proper place. You flourished as a peasant, you flourished as a member of the priesthood, you flourished as an aristocrat or nobility. So being in your proper place and doing your proper place properly, being a good peasant, a good priest, or a good aristocrat, doing your job well, has become a form of flourishing. You can see, of course, the limitations because it's quite exclusive. So this notion of flourishing gets played around with throughout history. Different societies develop different notions of flourishing. So in the Indian system, you have this notion of flourishing about being in your proper place. And if you flourish properly, if you do your function properly, then maybe in your next life you re-emerge at a high level. So this flourishing is not unique to Hegel, but what he did was he linked it to the notion of freedom. And he linked it to the notion that our flourishing to become free people was to overcome necessities of say, labouring in a factory. He developed the notion in a way which Marx could pick up. He made flourishing something which evolved in history, and we revise our notion of flourishing in history as we engage in practice. As we engage with each other, it evolves over time. So in my paper, I talked about the evolution of the notion of humanity, when initially, of course, to flourish was to be a white man only. And then we have this history of struggle to include black people, then black women, and so on and so forth. So the history of flourishing is a history of ever-increasing inclusivity. But there are many examples, of course, in history where there are backward steps. So under fascism, the idea of flourishing was that you can only flourish within your nation, in your ethnic group. So that made you a superior person. So there are many cul-de-sacs about flourishing, different arguments, different ways of arguing about it. but the key point is that for Hegel, flourishing was an evolving issue, an evolving idea which manifests itself in history. And that was what was new, this notion of evolving the idea of flourishing in and through history. And Marx picked that up. Marx picked it up beautifully in terms of looking at the pauperization of the working class, the antithesis of flourishing, their militarization, the antithesis of flourishing, and he saw that the overthrow of capitalism was necessary to actually enable people to flourish. So you're quite right, it's nothing new about flourishing. It goes back to 2,000 years. All philosophies, or in all parts of the world, have notions of what flourishing is. Hegel's contribution was to talk about it being a dynamic aspect of history evolving, which Marx beautifully picked up in his analysis of capitalism and in his notions of economic production and so forth. So yes, you're quite right, yeah. But Naeem, yeah.
Yeah, I think, thank you, Paul, for the introduction. I mean, as a Marxist, I must confess that I am actually, believe in dialectical materialism.
Yeah,
My understanding is that Marx actually picked up the idea of dialectics from Hegel, and that's why he was a young Hegelian. But also, I mean, sometimes they call themselves left Hegelian as well.
Yeah.
And I think he then took that thing forward, saying the dialectics does not just apply in the realms of ideas, but it actually applies in material conditions. So, for example, in fact, I mean, and this analysis based on dialectical materialism has been taken further by people like Lenin and Mao and others. So, the understanding of the contradictions for Marxists has become the central point of understanding society and how to change it. And I think, in fact, Marxists would argue that every science, all right, is basically an understanding of contradictions. So, for example, atomic physics is an understanding of the movements of electrons around protons, so positive and negative, magnetism and everything else. So it is actually the contradictions that make the world move. So the whole history, when Marx says our history is the history of struggle, is this history of the struggle of the opposites. So the working class against the oppressing class, the peasantry against the landlords. In fact, he said all history hitherto has been that. And that's how humanity moves forward through that struggle, through the resolution of that contradiction, just in the realms of ideas. So you put forward a thesis, you have an antithesis, you then have a debate, and then you come up with a reformed and a better thesis. So I think that applies and I think you see Mao took that forward by writing his essays on contradictions, on how you understand contradiction. I mean, this is where we say that there isn't just two classes. There isn't even in an international world. There are many classes still. And how you join those together, that was the work that a lot of the Marxists did in the 20th century. And that actually took humanity forward. So, for example, the Chinese Revolution was an understanding of contradictions. The imperialist contradictions, the contradictions between imperialism as well. So they took advantage of the Second World War. And all that understanding is what dialectical materialism is all about.
There are 3 points about that I can respond to. First of all, contradiction is an idea. It's a concept.
Well, reality, contradiction between negative and positive.
Contradiction is a concept. There's no contradiction in nature. It doesn't have a mind in nature. There's no contradiction between molecules and protons and neutrons. But we humans give something we see a meaning, and we call it a contradiction. So a contradiction is an idea. It doesn't exist on its own. It's a human way of seeing things. That doesn't refute Marx, but it illustrates the close connection between ideas and our concept of reality. Now the other thing is, which is an important part of this debate, is that, and Marx himself said this on many occasions in his more detailed analysis, if there's no necessary reason for the world to change, there are contradictions, as we say, that doesn't generate automatically change for the better. It doesn't mean that capitalism will be abolished on its own. It just raises the potentiality of abolition. In other words, it requires human agency to bring it down. So this notion that there's some sort of strange contradictions in the universe which would be there even if my brain was dead doesn't make sense, because it is a contradictions, by the way. If you look at contradictions in terms of capitalism, if you unravel this notion of contradiction, unravel it, you come across a moral theory. You come across moral ethical theories about being pauperized, being immiserated, being exploited. Those are moral statements. There's no such thing as exploitation in nature. They're just happenings. We humans give something we see a meaning, an interpretation, which we don't like, and we try and change it. So we attribute to that slave in that field with the overseer, we attribute the abuse of slavery, and we try and change that arrangement. So without the idea of anything, nothing can happen. The issue is how does that idea emerge? Well, quite clearly, as you've indicated, and as Marx also argued, the idea of something emerges through experience, through collective experience of oppression. The idea of women's oppression didn't emerge in men's heads, it emerged in women's heads. And it was their collective voicing of their own experiences of mistreatment in domestic and other capacities. And out of this emerged contradictions. But the contradictions don't exist outside people's heads, I can assure you. The issue is what we make of them. How do we try and change them? This is what Marx is all about, and of course he got stuck about it. Okay, but Marx has got 6 pages in all his writings. He's got 6 pages in the Communist Manifesto where he said the bourgeoisie dig their own graves. They're their own grave diggers, and the triumph of the proletariat is inevitable.
Yeah.
Everywhere else, he doesn't say that at all.
It doesn't mean anything, that doesn't.
He points out that only human beings can change history, and only people with the right ideas in their heads can change history. That's why he talks about the vanguard. That's why he talks about thinkers.
Yeah, I mean, there is a contradiction, isn't it? I mean, there is a slave owner working in a collecting sugarcane. Okay.
Yeah.
The contradiction is that slave does not want to work 20 hours.
No.
But the slave master wants him to work 20 hours.
Yeah.
Right. That's a physical contradiction. There is no imaginary thing about it. That is reality. That's a dispute. Just outside our mind.
That's a dispute.
Yeah. It's not an experience. It's a reality. Right. And it's a contradiction, because the slave owner has to make sure that sugarcane is cut at the most cost-effective manner, which means he has to use the slave to do it. The slave knows, all right, for him to be able to survive, he has to overcome this. So that is a contradiction. It's physical. It's as real as anything can be. All right, and that is where then ideas come from, that contradiction. So the slave gets the idea of getting free of its slave master. That's an idea.
You
right?
just said the idea. You just said the idea.
Yeah, but the idea is not the contradiction. The contradiction is the reality, right? It is the coming together of those contradictions, the battle that takes place between the two, that gives ideas to the slave and to the slave owner.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay. So the ideas come from the contradictions. The ideas come from the material reality. That's where I think Marx's contribution to dialectical was, and that's why it became dialectical materialism. And I think Mao understood it very well, because and he applied it very well in China. And he also understood that there are contradictions within imperialism as well, and he was able to exploit that as well. So I mean, I think it's to say that contradiction itself is what we imagine in our minds is.
No, I didn't say imagine. I didn't say imagine. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that what we call contradictions are not real. What I'm saying is that we need to have an understanding of what's going on. We need to interpret events. What you call a contradiction is an interpretation of our experience, which we want to change.
Yeah, the presentation that we are making is, but the presentation itself gets modified. So we, theory, practice, and theory. That's what Marxism is about, and that's why, I mean, in fact, particularly Mao, emphasize that. So you which is thesis, antithesis, and everything else. So you have a practical experience from which you derive your ideas. You then implement those ideas, and you learn further from that implementation, and you derive. So there is a relationship between material and ideas.
Absolutely, yeah. We're not disagreeing about that, are we? No.